Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer Dempsey from American Farmland Trust. We're going to get started in another minute here. We're just going to get a few things set up, and then we'll start the webinar. All right, so I have just a couple minutes after 2 p.m., so I think we'll get started. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll be hearing about the agricultural land easements component of the Federal Ag Conservation Easement Program. My name is Jennifer Dempsey, and I'm the Director of American Farmland Trust Farmland Information Center, and I'll be helping run today's call. Before we get started, I wanted to review just a few items. First, we'll be recording today's call. You might have heard this as you logged in. We'll post the webinar on the FIC website after the program. Second, we've muted all attendees, and this is to avoid problems with feedback. During the call, there will be a few different opportunities to ask questions. We'd like you to use the question feature to do this. You should see a control panel in the right-hand corner of your screen. It may be minimized now, but if you expand the box, you'll be able to type your questions and send them to us. Just keep in mind that all participants will be able to see your questions. We'll review them and then read them out loud for the presenter. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can during the allotted time. We'll also write up responses to all the questions we receive, even though those that sort of filter in after the call, and then we'll post questions and answers along with the webinar on the Land Information Center website. If you're having any technical issues, please use the raise your hand feature on the control panel, and this will just help us keep this stream of issues separate from questions about content. We have some AFT staff on hand to help who are just looking for raised hands. And then finally, you may notice that there's a handout. That, in fact, is just another copy of the agenda with just a few additional pieces of information. During today's program, we'll be hearing from Jerome Faulkner, National Easement Program Specialist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And also on the line from NRCS are Kim Burns, Director of the Easement Programs Division, John Rissler, Branch Chief of Easement Programs, and Stephanie Goya, Natural Resources Specialist. So they'll be on hand to answer questions. And a final piece of business before we get going is we just wanted to find out your experience with the Federal Farmland Protection Program. So I'm going to launch a poll question, and then we'll close that out and turn it over to Jerome. So the first poll question should be popping up on your screen. And this just has to do with whether you participated in any of the federal programs, either the old FPP, FRPP, or ACEP-ALE, or a combination, or none. So if you could choose a selection. Okay, I'm going to close it out. We can see that, so you're a really pretty experienced group. Most of you, almost two-thirds, 60% about, have had experience with FRPP and ACEP-ALE. Just ACEP-ALE, another 10%. Only 14% of you have not had experience with any of the programs. So you can see those results there. Just take a minute to look at that. Okay, now we're going to turn it over to Jerome Faulkner to start with the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for calling in this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jerome Faulkner. I'm with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I am one of our National Easement Program Managers. I manage the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, Agricultural Land Easement Component here in Washington, D.C. in our NRCS headquarters office. And today I'm going to give you a brief overview on ALE, as we like to call it in NRCS jargon, ACEP-ALE, and some of the background, and we're going to talk about selection process and even some of the requirements for it. So to get started here, first slide that I have here is just going to be a program overview of what we're talking about today. As I said before, I'm going to be talking about the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ACEP, and in ACEP there are two components: the Wetland Reserve Easements and the Agricultural Land Easements. And today I'm going to focus on the component that I manage, which is the Agricultural Land Easement component. That component of ACEP provides cost share assistance to eligible entities in order to purchase agricultural land easements on eligible land across the country, and it's available in all 50 states. Go to the next slide here. All right. So what is ACEP-ALE? ACEP-ALE, the purpose of ALE is to protect the agricultural use and the future viability and related conservation values on eligible land by limiting non-agricultural uses of the land. That's one of the purposes. It's a second purpose of ALE is to protect grazing uses and related conservation values by restoring and conserving land. ALE originated from the 2014 Farm Bill, and it was a combination of two of our prior easement programs in NRCS. As Jennifer mentioned earlier in the poll, the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program was its predecessor, and the Grassland Reserve Program. The difference between ALE brought both the purposes of both of those programs together to protect working lands in conservation easements. The Grassland Reserve Program was a little bit different than the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program because the Grassland Reserve Program was an easement program in which NRCS purchased grassland easements from private landowners, and those easements were held by the government, by NRCS from those landowners. FRPP is similar to how ALE is managed. NRCS, and I'll get a little bit more into that later, but for ALE, but in FRPP, NRCS provided cost share assistance to entities to purchase conservation easements on land in order to protect it and keep it in agricultural use. In ALE, we provide cost share assistance to entities for the entities to purchase conservation easements on private land. And in ALE, our cost shares cannot exceed 50% of the fair market value of the easement. That fair market value is typically in ALE determined by an appraisal of the property, and there is another option that allows for a higher 75%, and I'll talk about that in a later slide here. But those values are the cost share assistance that we provide is determined generally by appraisal using United States appraisal according to our specifications, using USPAP or even a Yellow Book appraisal is possible, where we determine before and after value, and NRCS provides 50% cost share of the value that the easement is taking out of the land. The entity is responsible for providing the other 50% of the value, and the requirements are the entity must provide an amount that is at least equivalent to the federal share. As part of the entity's amount that they can provide, a qualified conservation contribution from the landowner can be considered if the entity contributes at least 50% of the federal share. In other words, the federal share can be 50%, the entity can provide 25%, and then a qualified donation from the landowner can provide the other 25% to make up the entire appraised fair market value of the easement. Just as a clarification, there is no requirement in ALE for a landowner donation. The landowner donation has to be voluntary, and the entity contribution must be cash and come from a source other than the landowner. And the entity cannot include land from another parcel or in-kind contributions. So there has to be some cash provided from the entity for their contribution. And the landowner cannot be responsible for 100% of the entity's share of the contribution in ALE. As I mentioned earlier, there are the standard amount that NRCS provides for ALE cost share assistance is 50%, but there are exceptions to this cost share, to the 50% contribution cap for cost share. One of those is what we call grasslands of special environmental significance. This is a waiver that NRCS grants. NRCS grants this waiver as site specific, and it's dependent upon criteria that's determined at the state office and the individual state office level. The waiver is granted to allow up to 75% cost share assistance for the easement fair market value. The state conservationist at the state NRCS level has the ability to grant this waiver to provide 75% of the easement value, and the entity and landowner donation would contribute the other 25% of the value. The state conservationist also has the separate authority to decrease the entity's cash contribution requirement in the cases of projects of special significance. So in other words, this waiver allows, if a project of special significance is determined by the state conservationist at the state office level, it will allow the entity's share of the to be reduced, and as a result, the landowner donation can be increased towards the entity's share in projects of special significance. In projects of special significance, NRCS does not provide any additional cost share assistance. It just allows the ratios from the landowner between the landowner and entity to be different than the standard. And both of these exceptions to the 50% cost share are determined after site-specific evaluation of the parcels that are submitted for applications. So that's a quick, simple overview. And right now, and throughout the whole presentation, I'll be pausing as I go through to allow for questions. And so right now we're
yeah. So Jerome, there is a question. So someone has asked, can you go into a little more detail about what defines a project of special significance?
Yes. So a project of special significance is one in which there is increased environmental or conservation benefit on the property. An example of a project of special significance may be one that is protecting a very significant resource that's in decline, or a resource that's rare, or maybe the one of a few that are left in the state or environment, or one where a project that may complete other resource concern or resource management of a certain watershed or area. So there is a lot of flexibility for project of special significance at the state office level for making that determination.
Okay, so Jerome, would someone then the entity would be working with the state office to help?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the entity would ask the state office if could they determine if this is project special significance, and provide some of the reasons behind that, such as this may provide this particular conservation benefit.
Okay, and just to loop back then, if the project is defined as a project of special significance, that means then that those resources need to be protected in the easement, right?
Right, yes. So any of, and even in the grassland of special environmental significance. So when those additional cost share exceptions occur, there must be easement language that then addresses why that cost share, why those exceptions were received.
Okay. So there aren't any other questions at this point. So if you'd like to move on to the next chunk of content.
Sure. So the next section I'm going to be talking about just an overview on funding, our allocation process, and then an overview of the selection process for that NRCS goes through. So in this slide here is a general. This is the funding, the Farm Bill funding levels for this is for ACEP, for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. So including, this is both components, the Wetland Reserve Easement component and the Agricultural Land Easement component. For instance, in fiscal year 17, the 2014 Farm Bill authorized $500 million in ACEP funds. Out of that $500 million, after the Office of Management and Budget, after sequestration and other budgetary financial items, I'll say, gave NRCS $333 million available funds to implement the program in 2017. In 2018, the Farm Bill levels for ACEP dropped to $250 million, And out of that $250 million, NRCS, after the Office of Management budget adjustments, received $172 million of those funds for implementation of ACEP. And out of that 172 in fiscal year 18 and the 333 million, that is the NRCS working level. So that includes what is necessary to provide financial assistance for purchasing easements in the program, and also technical assistance by NRCS. So our employees that are related to implementing the program, and all of the technical folks that NRCS has that's related to the ACEP program. Just in comparison, so in an agricultural land easement component, in 17 out of that 333 million, we allocated 115 million in financial assistance dollars to the states. These are the dollars, financial assistance dollars are the dollars in which we provide to entities to purchase easements with. And so far in fiscal year 2018, we've allocated to the states $60 million in financial assistance dollars to purchase, to provide cost share assistance to purchase agricultural land easements. For ALE. So a lot of times we get the question, so how are we in headquarters determining the allocation amounts that each individual states receive in ALE? We do it in a multi-part process, and this is similar to how other NRCS programs operate. Is the allocation process starts off with a state resource assessment. So in the state resource assessment, each individual state office provides a detailed input of all of their programmatic needs in the upcoming fiscal year. And we do a state resource assessment actually for 3 years. So each year, a state would provide their state resource assessment for a fiscal year. Like for instance, for this fiscal year, we're going to when we do our state resource assessment, the state would provide its the anticipated program needs for ACEP, and not just ACEP, but for all of their financial assistance programs that they receive for fiscal year 19, 20, and 21. And in that, they will detail what they anticipate their needs are for their general funds, any initiatives which are special areas that have been assigned by the chief of NRCS to target certain resources and concerns, and any of the future directions that they have for that program, meaning in the future, or considering their past amounts been allocated, where do they think their program is going to grow or increase applications, or their need to increase funds to handle their increased applications. So if states have been doing any kind of outreach, or if they anticipate that they have an increased demand in later fiscal years, this is where they can indicate that to us. That state resource assessment is collected for all the states. It's rolled up and provided to each of the program managers. In my case, for agriculture conservation easement program, ag land easements, but we do it for conservation ESP, for FRPP, for EQIP, sorry, and even our programs that are repealed, but we still have work to be completed in them. That state resource assessment is taken, it's quality controlled, looked at to make sure that the numbers that are provided by the states are correct, because it's it's a large database actually of all of their requests, and it's broken down, depending on the year, it's broken down maybe even by number of easements that they may want to acquire in the years, or what they anticipate the values of those easements are. So we run through and quality control it, and then we use that state resource assessment to help in determining how to allocate some of the funds that we receive in the next fiscal year. We also use the prior year performance of the state office. In other words, their prior year obligation history, what has been their, the past 3 years of their obligations, how compared to the amount that has been allocated to them, what has been the amount that they have returned in funds, or if they've requested additional funds in addition to the allocation, and did they then obligate those funds. We also look at the capacity of the state. In other words, where are they at in the number of people that they have that are able to perform the actions needed for the program. Do they have an easement program specialist? Do they have a system in place to implement a program if it's increased in funding? And then we look at our available funds that we have for the individual programs. So for ALE, we would look at what our HC goals for ALE, if we have any areas that the chief of NRCS has specifically said we're going to use easement programs to address resource concerns, and any other leadership input, and then we would provide a overall recommendation of our available funds in that fiscal year, and that recommendation, that allocation recommendation that the program managers provide, then goes through an extensive review by leadership, where they are not just looking at the individual programs, but they're looking at the overall programs and what a state may receive in the recommended allocation, and how they're able to handle that. So it's a long process that we start usually we start the state resource assessment in May, in order to have an allocation usually out in October. So that's our how we determine how much a state is receiving in financial assistance and technical assistance dollars. Now I'm just going to give a high-level overview of the application and selection process that occurs for participation in the agricultural land easement program. Not inclusive of everything that may be involved, but just kind of an overview for those that may be in a small percentage that have not participated in ALE in the recent years. So the initially states announce that they have funding and that they are receiving applications, and they'll announce, state office will announce a application cutoff date, where they will evaluate all of the applications that are received for ALE. Each state evaluates these applications using ranking criteria for the resources of concern, and they have ranking cutoff dates, which are set by the state office. In headquarters, we provide a timeline to state offices. This year, we provided a timeline that showed where we suggested that they have their ranking cutoff dates, but states can make their own ranking cutoff dates as they see that they can be able to successfully implement the program in a fiscal year. We give the funding to the states at the beginning of the fiscal year. They announce their applications. The ranking is based off the ALE ranking is based off a 400-point system, standardized throughout the nation. 200 points of the ranking sheet is limited to the national criteria, and that national criteria is provided in the ACEP manual, and so those questions are standard throughout all the nation for those 200 points, and then the other 200 points are state developed criteria. So those are more, states have a lot of flexibility in developing their criteria. ACEP manual provides some guidelines and areas that they have to consider, but it's really designed to be flexible to allow states to focus individually states on where they want their ALE funds to be where their priorities are for their ALE funds. In the ranking criteria, there is the 400 points, 200 on national and 200 state. We don't at the national level determine how they separate each individual point. So we allow the states to determine that, so that they can't. There is the ability even in the national, as long as they have 200 points in the national criteria, they can have the point spread between the required questions, however they want to in their state. The state then selects their determined after the states go through the ranking. They select their funded parcels and will notify the entities which parcels they have pre-approved and selected for funding, and then the entity and the state office will work towards entering into the agreements for those parcels. The agreement process does take a bit of time and does require the entities to provide additional paperwork, because those are, for ALE, we enter into cooperative agreements for non-certified entities, and for entities that have been certified, they can enter into grant agreements. All of those ALE agreements, cooperative or grant agreements, go through our grant agreement services branch in NRCS for review to make sure that they are meeting the federal regulations for grants and cooperative agreements. And so that does take some time to get through that process to make sure we have all the proper paperwork in order for correct agreements and obligations. So that's like I said, I didn't want to get too far into depth about the application selection process, but that's a general overview. And right now, I would like to pause and.
Yep. So a few questions came in, Jerome. First was, do you have any estimate of ALE funds that might be available in fiscal year 2019?
Okay. Unfortunately, I do not. The reason being is that the Farm Bill, 2014 Farm Bill only went through 2018, so there isn't a Farm Bill amount for 2019, and at this point, I haven't seen any action really on whether or not we're going to have a Farm Bill passed by the end of 2018. And if we don't get a Farm Bill passed, we'll probably be under a continuing resolution at some point in 2019 if we're waiting for a Farm Bill. And I would assume that the continuing resolution would be at the same levels that we are currently in 2018. But that's my professional estimate.
Okay, and then there was also a question when you were on the application and selection slide about getting a sense of how long that process would take from start to finish.
Well, from application, so the announcement for that we have states have open applications. Each has to be for 30 days. So we have to have a 30-day period from when we announce that we have funds to when that first cutoff can occur. And then there's typically, after we receive applications, we have to then evaluate all of those applications which can take anywhere from 30 to 60 days generally before we have done enough due diligence to really determine have a ranking, and then determine which one of the applications would be funded. Typically, I would say in most states right now, we are towards the middle of March is generally going to be when the first application cutoff, the ranking cutoff has been established. So we won't see, some states have started earlier, but we won't see really announcements or states contacting anyone that they have for potential funding probably until next month.
Okay, there's another question about how many entities have been certified by NRCS to date?
Yeah, I think right now we are at 6 certified entities that have been certified for NRCS. Some have been certified in multiple states, so the number of states are a lot larger than the number of entities we have. But yeah, last time I checked, I believe it is 6.
Oh, can you share who the entities are, or is that publicly available somewhere, Jerome?
I don't believe it's publicly available. I can't remember. I don't think we can share it. I don't think that's part of what they've agreed to. But I don't have the list right now in front of me. No, sorry.
That's okay. We'll move on to the next one. So there was another question sort of looping back to the first segment. And so this related to projects of special significance again, and just wanting sort of the resources that spell that out so someone can sort of see it in writing, you know, whether it's the rule, the program manual.
Yeah, so there is, in the program manual, there is, and in my presentation, I have a link, I believe, on one of my slides to e-directives where the ACEP program manual is located at. But there is a section in the manual that describes what a state has to do to consider something as a project of special significance.
Okay. Okay, so I think we'll move on to the next poll question then at this point, and then Jerome, you can go to your next chunk of content. So the next question actually relates to Matt that launched that poll. Okay. Let's just take another minute. So I'm waiting because the percentage of people voting keeps climbing. So. It's not that I've fallen off. Okay, so we'll just give it another couple of seconds. Yeah, and we do see that this says select only one, but we know that some of you may have combined sources. So maybe if you could go with your sort of primary other source of matching funds, that might help inform your voting. . So I'm going to close the poll. And I'm going to share the results. So it looks like most of you are relying on state funding, but also local public funding. Very impressive. And then private is down at the bottom, and other federal programs. Landowner donations at the bottom. Okay. All right, Jerome, so now you can continue with your presentation, the next section.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Make sure that we're on my slide. Let's go to the next slide here.
Actually, Jerome, before you get started, just to clarify, is it true now that REPI funds can be used to match your funding?
Yes. So, yes, REPI funds, Readiness Environmental Protection Initiative funds through the Department of Defense can be used as ALE program match for entities. That was the REPI funds, and they have always been able to match when the Department of Defense passed the statute funding REPI, it specifically allowed those funds to be used to match USDA programs. And so that is the only source of federal dollars that can be used to match ALE funds.
Thank you.
Oh, good question. Thank you. So back to the slideshow. So now this section of slides, before we pause again, we're going to do an overview, not a complete overview because that would take probably a couple of days, of the easement requirements that we have for ALE. In general, so for ALE, entity will require hold title to the ALE, manage, monitor, and enforce the easement. The document that determines the entity's responsibilities and NRCS's responsibilities is the ALE agreement, again, a cooperative agreement for non-certified entities or a grant agreement for certified entities. And that agreement details the responsibilities of the entity and of NRCS and in acquiring, managing, and monitoring and enforcing the easement. In these next set of slides, I'm going to just go briefly over some of the easement requirements that we have. I'm going to go over the survey, the baseline documentation report, impervious surface requirements, building envelope, subdivision requirements, some of the other deed requirements, and specifically I'm going to go over the agricultural land easement plan as one of the requirements as part of the program participation. So, and I just really want to provide some overview so that entities that are listening feel a little bit more comfortable talking about these items, applying or talking about them with your state, the local state NRCS folks, so you can have a better understanding of what and why those requirements are, why they are. So for ag, and so this is assuming that you've already entered into an AL agreement and you have parcels that you are wanting to place under a conservation easement. For surveys, so for ALE, all of our surveys must comply with the survey standards of the state that the easement is going to be in, and you must obtain a boundary survey and legal description in the following cases. So if the easement area is less or only a small portion of the entire property that's described in the legal description of record, then you would need to acquire a survey in order to delineate out the easement area. Or if the current legal description is not accurate. So if we have a parcel and the legal description for that parcel is not accurate, then we would ask that a survey be acquired for that easement area. And I just want to note, surveys are in the agreement language. Surveys, if a survey is needed, they're the responsibility of the eligible entity that is receiving the funds to acquire. So NRCS does not provide any cost share assistance for the survey. So the third reason that a survey may be needed is if the ALE funds are used to protect an area, protect less than the entire area protected by a larger conservation easement, and the current legal description does not match the ACEP-ALE portion. So in general, if you have a legal description that can accurately describe the portion that is going to be enrolled in the ALE easement, then you do not need a survey. But if you have a legal description that is not accurate, or the description you have, the easement area is less than that, then and there's no way to really describe that outside of any other description you have, legal description, then you would need a survey. And again, that survey would have to come out of funds that the entity has. For each ALE easement, a baseline documentation report is required. So the baseline documentation report has to be developed prior to the closing. The baseline report doesn't have to be included in the easement, but it has to be referenced in the ALE easement deed language deed, and it can be kept. It doesn't have to be a copy. Can be kept by the entity. Doesn't have to be kept by NRCS, as long as it references where that baseline documentation report is in the easement, agricultural land easement deed. The baseline report, just as it says, it's a baseline of the property, describing, containing maps, reported descriptions on the properties, pictures and items. Included are the location, the land use, the land cover on the property at the time that the easement is acquired, structures or buildings on the property at the time, location and maps of the property, pictures and maps of the property. NRCS, the ACEP program manual has an exhibit that provides what must be included in the baseline documentation report. And that exhibit is available. That exhibit and the ACEP manual are available publicly on the NRCS eDirectives website. The ACEP manual is in the NRCS manual section under 440, section 440, part 528 is the ACEP manual. Each of the ag land easements have to have a limitation on the impervious surface described in the deed language. In general, the limitation that we, for NRCS on impervious surface amounts is 2% of the easement area, which that does exclude NRCS approved conservation practices. The state conservationist has the ability to provide a waiver up to 10%. So you can have a 10% max impervious surface amount if that waiver is granted by the state conservationist. And that waiver is on an individual parcel by parcel basis, and determined based off of the agricultural use on that property and what may already exist on that property at the time. Our impervious surface definition is our impervious surface is defined for NRCS as the material that does not allow water to percolate into the soil on the parcel, including but not limited to buildings with or without flooring, paved areas, and any other surface that's covered by asphalt, concrete, or roofs. So anything that's covering the soil and not allowing water to percolate to the soil. So NRCS, we require that building envelope must be identified on our agricultural land easements. So you must, as part of the ag land easement, you must have a map or identify the existing building envelope area, any proposed building envelopes, or a statement that there are no building envelopes on the property. We do allow building envelopes to be located after closing. If the conservation easement deed specifies the number of building envelopes, NRCS can approve these floating building envelopes. They require state conservation approval of the location of the prior to construction. So NRCS for subdivision, the ranking and evaluation in the ranking sheet takes into account subdivision. We provide 3 options for allowing or not allowing subdivision on ALE easements. That is no subdivision, a pre-approved subdivision, or a subdivision that's allowed with NRCS and entity approval after closing. So obviously a no subdivision, if an easement language contains that then there is no subdivision allowed on that property. In the pre-approved subdivision, these are identified and approved by state conservationists prior to closing. Both the approved number of subdivisions and the boundaries must be identified in the easement deed. And under the pre-approved subdivision, no further NRCS review is required at the time of future conveyance of the parcels, as long as it's as identified in the deed. So if they're pre-approved subdivision, then that subdivision can occur as the deed allows, once it has been approved. If they're not approved, if subdivisions are not identified prior to closing, the entity holding the easement deed must submit a request to state conservationists for approval prior to authorizing a subdivision. The entity must certify that the requested subdivision is required to keep all the farm or ranch parcels in production and viable for agricultural use, and that a separate conveyance of the farm or ranch parcels subject to the agricultural land easement will move the land from one, or the ranch parcels will move it from the land from one agricultural operation to another. So in other words, where NRCS is main reason concern about subdivision is we want to make sure that we have viable agricultural parcels on the property, on the easement area. And so that is our main concern, is in allowing subdivision after an easement has closed is, do we have a viable agricultural operation after the subdivision has occurred? So for our ALE easement deeds, we have what we call the AL minimum deed terms addendum, which is what lists all of our easement deed requirements needed in a conservation easement for ALE purposes. So this addresses the regulatory deed requirements that NRCS requires for all ALE easements. This AL minimum deeds addendum is attached to the agreement. It's also included in the application package that entities receive, so it's all up front. It's in the minimum deed terms are an exhibit in our ACEP manual, and there's three options for use of the deed terms for a cooperative agreement. You can attach the AL minimum deed terms addendum to your cooperative agreement. There's three ways to use the AL minimum deed terms in an conservation easement. You can attach the minimum deed terms to your conservation easement. There is instructions on how to attach the deed terms to the deed. There's a couple of paragraphs that have to be entered into the conservation easement language when you attach the deed terms to your conservation easement deed. You can incorporate the AL minimum deed terms into the language and body of the conservation easement deed. That requires a review by our realty specialist in order to make sure that is incorporated properly, and that the AL minimum deed terms are incorporated as verbatim as they are. Or a third option is to, if you have more than one parcel or more than one agreement that you've entered into for ALE, you can develop an easement deed template that requires a longer review, but in the end, an approved template is approved for use throughout the Farm Bill. So throughout the time, if you enter it so for future agreements or future parcels that you may get funded, you can use that template throughout the Farm Bill. Of course, we are in the last year of the Farm Bill now, so that I would take that in consideration if you're thinking about having a template. But we have approved quite a few easement deed templates during the 2014 Farm Bill. I think we're up to about 19 now for use. And it's a quicker way to have your have assurance that you're including all of your deed requirements in the ALE easements. Okay, we'll stop for questions now, Jim.
Yeah, so number came in. Some relate to building envelopes. So you were specifying under what circumstances. There's sort of a follow-up about, do the building envelopes need to be placed on the survey or only on a map?
They could be placed on a map, yeah.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, where would someone find sort of all of the requirements that relate to that item? Like, is that spelled out additionally in the program manual, or is there additional guidance somewhere else that an entity could access?
Yes, so two places. The program manual talks about building envelopes, and also the agreement language, cooperative agreement language also.
Okay, and then there's another question. If the landowner doesn't request a subdivision in the deed of easement, can they still apply after closing?
So it really would depend on what language the easement deed, if they said no, if there is no subdivision in the easement deed language that's closed, then,
Yes.
then to subdivide. But if they, it would depend on what language they recorded in the easement deed language, yeah. So if there was if there had been prohibited, subdivision had been prohibited in the easement deed language, then that's what would rule the ability to subdivide, the terms of the easement deed.
Okay, and then about how long does the template review process take?
We give for template review, it's taken about, I'd say about 3 months for a template to be reviewed and approved, and that's probably from submission to getting a finding, review, approval. There is some back and forth between our realty specialists and the attorneys for the entities. So they do vary depending on how much back and forth is needed or how much clarification, or so I'd say about 3 months altogether. I think that's what we're looking average, but some take longer than others because of a lot of back and forth. So it's not a quick process, definitely. And we do recommend that if you want to use, so we recommend that if you want to use have an easement template deed, to go through the process of submitting that template deed prior to the fiscal year that you want to use it, so that you can have it approved and ready to use for the next fiscal year. And I know that's a little, well, we don't have the next fiscal year figured out for ALE until the Farm Bill, but if you're interested and has an entity interested in having a template, we are still right now reviewing and approving template deeds, and when it comes to the next Farm Bill, and depending on that language, we'll have to evaluate what our template deeds that we have that were approved in the 2014 Farm Bill and what changes may need to occur. But we will definitely be willing to work with all of the deeds that we've already approved out there.
Okay, and then a final question. It relates to impervious surfaces. Does a gravel road qualify? And maybe, Jerome, when you answer this, if you could tell folks where they find sort of what is included in impervious surfaces, where they can find that information, that would be helpful.
Well, I did read the definition for impervious surfaces on the slide. A gravel road, because it allows water to percolate through, is not considered an impervious surface. So anything generally that's going, and the impervious surface definition is in the ACEP manual, anything that's going to prevent water from reaching the ground, considered impervious surface. But I think, let me see, I think the definition is in my manual, but in subpart, so part 528, subpart probably G is where our deed title and plan requirements are.
Okay, thank you. I think those were all the questions we had at this point, so you could move on to the ALE plan.
Okay, thank you. So next section and of the presentation, last section, is is about concerning ALE plans. What an ALE plan is, so and how we view ALE plans for the program. ALE plans are a statutory requirement that was introduced with the ALE program in 2014 Farm Bill. The 2014 Farm Bill said that all ACEP-ALE easements must be subject to an agricultural land easement plan. NRCS, we defined what, we didn't have a definition prior to the 2014 Farm Bill for agricultural land easement plan, so we defined agricultural land easement plan in our ACEP regulations, in the interim rule and the final rule, in 7 CFR 1468.3, and it's defined as describes activities which promote the long-term viability of the land to meet the purposes for which the easement was acquired for. ALE plans are required, to be mentioned, are required. The easement, ALE easement must reference the ALE plan. Eligible entities are responsible for providing the plan or the component plans, and we'll talk about component plans in the next few slides, to NRCS for review and approval, but entities are allowed to request technical assistance from NRCS in developing the plan. Once a plan is, or a component plan is implemented, then the entity is responsible to ensure that the landowner remains in compliance with the plan. So the ALE agreement provides two options for ALE plans. So NRCS can develop the ALE plan, or the entity can develop the ALE plan. It can be provided by the entity. It still has to be approved by NRCS, and that approval is checking to make sure that the ALE plan meets the manual requirements. The manual details for ALE plans are in the directives and the ACEP-ALE manual in Part G. Yeah, so Part G of the manual. And generally, the ag land easement plan describes activities for the long-term viability of the land and include a description of the farm or ranch management system, the required and recommended conservation or management practices are identified. The plan must also identify additional or specific criteria associated with permissible and prohibited activities consistent with the terms of the deed. For example, if a deed specifies that the location of the building envelope may be adjusted if it does not adversely affect agricultural resources, the plan should describe those agricultural resources and how they may be impacted by construction of structures. Not every ALE plan may need to specify additional or specific criteria for the deed terms. That has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. And ALE plans are living documents, so it is understood that the ALE plan may be adjusted depending on the management of the agricultural management occurring on the easement area at the time. The plan can also establish the limit or reiterate the limit on the impervious surfaces to be allowed, consistent with the farm and ranch management system and consistent with the limitations identified in the deed. If a parcel includes grassland, highly erodible land, or forest land, then a component plan for the grassland, highly erodible cropland, or forest land must be incorporated by reference into the ALE plan. And each of those component plans have requirements that are in section 528.63 in the ACEP manual. So the ALE plans, like I said, describe the activities that promote the long-term viability of the land to meet the purposes for which the easement was acquired for. Describe the farm or ranch management system, recommended or required practices consistent with the conservation or management practices consistent with the deed terms, permissible prohibited activities that are consistent with the terms of the deed, and establish a limit on impervious surface and incorporate the plan by reference. For the component plans, there's 3 component plans for ALE plan. There is the grassland component plan, highly erodible land component plan on highly erodible cropland. This plan is was the ACEP-ALE cropland plan is essentially the conservation plan that was in the former FRPT program, and if forest land are included on the easement, then there's a forest land component plan that has to be included. The grasslands management component plan is required if a parcel is enrolled under the grassland land eligibility. So that is one of the purpose of one of the purposes of ALE that originated from the GRP program. Conservation plan if you have ACEP-ALE cropland. Forest management plan if the parcel is required if the parcel contains a continuous forest that exceeds the greater of 40 acres or 20% of the total easement area. So ALE plans are reviewed by NRCS. So NRCS has to ensure that the plans meet the ALE policy that's in the program manual requirements, whether or not the plan is developed by NRCS or developed by the entity, or even if developed by a third party such as a technical service provider. Like I mentioned before, NRCS will review those ALE plans to make sure they meet the program requirements. We'll note that a NRCS certified planner is not required to sign off on ALE plans that are completed by the entity. So one important item to note for ALE plans, NRCS, the landowner, and the entity are required, all 3 required for approval, changes, and updates to the ALE plan. So this is it's a approval required by everybody involved. It's not just a unilateral NRCS plan approval. The landowner is involved, and the entity is involved also. And these are living documents, and they should expect to be updated as the farm management systems change, or as the landowners work to address the resource concerns that may be identified, so we would anticipate updates based on those situations. All right, so that concludes what I have today for presentation, Jennifer, and I'm gonna we'll go to questions now over the ALE plans or the overall presentation, and then I'm gonna show also my.
So right now we don't have any questions in queue. So why don't we try to sneak in the last full question, and then we'll go back and answer any questions that come in now.
Okay.
So this is actually about ALE plans. So we'll launch this poll question. I'm just going to give it another few seconds. Okay, now I'm going to close it. Oh, I may have I may have quickly hidden the results, but for those of you who voted, it turned out that 82% of you said that NRCS staff are in fact developing your ALE plans, and then 18% reported that your program or land trust had developed your ALE plan, and then 0% reported other NRCS technical service providers.
Oh, that's good to know. I was not
So in the
such a
meantime,
high percentage.
did have some additional questions that came in. So first, can you just talk a little bit, Jerome, about how NRCS monitors the ALE plan, or how that happens?
Okay, yeah, sure. So NRCS, for the ALE plans, the responsibility to monitor an ALE plan is the entity as part of their monitoring of the easement area monitors the ALE plan. So NRCS does it involve itself with monitoring the ALE plan. We would just require that in the entity's monitoring report, they indicate that the landowner is following the ALE plan, or if there's a need for NRCS to help to update the ALE plan. Also, I will say though, on the highly erodible cropland conservation compliance, highly erodible cropland component plan, if the landowner is a participant in USDA programs and they have HEL cropland and the conservation plan related HEL cropland, we do check those as part of our highly erodible land compliance checks. So that's separate than if they were separate than from the ALE plan, because we have statutory requirements to check for HEL cropland compliance.
Okay, and then another question is, if a current landowner has an ALE plan through the NRCS office and land use remains the same, is that plan appropriate to use? So I'm wondering if they mean
if it's appropriate to continue
with
this plan.
Conservation plan.
Oh, well, so if they have a current conservation plan, we can use components of that conservation plan in developing the ALE plan, but there are some requirements such as identifying the purpose, surface, and other items that have to be added to it to make it meet the ALE plan requirements. So just having an outright conservation plan won't meet all the requirements that an ALE plan must have, but it does provide a good base to start with.
Okay, and then might be the final question is, can or would NRCS require new practices to an already existing ALE plan?
The requirements have to be consistent with the deed terms. So if there's any deed terms that may have been left out of the ALE plan, but not if it meets the if the ALE plan is meeting the requirements of the deed, then no, we wouldn't require anything new.
Okay, so another question just popped up. Do certified entities need to use the same minimum deed term addendum?
So certified entities, as part of the grant agreement that they enter into, have the option to, they can definitely use the same ALE minimum deed terms addendum if they want to use that, but they, as a service of being, as a perk of being certified, you can, certified entities are only required to, in their easement deed, use the regulatory deed requirements. So those are not in their easement deed language. So so they don't have to use the AL deed addendum. They don't have to use the attach and incorporate. They can just follow, as long as they follow the ACEP regulatory deed requirements in their deeds, they are within their agreement terms. Typically, what we see with certified entities is they will, the ones we have before they became certified, they had a deed template approved, and I'm assuming that they're using that deed template for all of their ALE easements, because then they have assurances that they are meeting the deed requirements in their deed template language before they became certified. Then after they became certified, we assume that they're using that deed template that they got approved.
Okay, are there any other questions out there? Oh, another one just popped in. So just to confirm, Jerome, is funding for the program contingent on the Farm Bill process? Yes.
We are, for the next fiscal year 19, we are contingent upon Farm Bill or a congressional continuing resolution for fiscal year 19 if we don't have a Farm Bill. So hopefully we have one or two.
Okay, so there's a question about the process for amending or changing the cooperative agreement, like if there's any flexibility around that, especially to correct maybe errors in the language.
In the I'm not sure if they mean the agreement language errors or maybe, yeah, we'd be willing to look at whatever errors that we have in the deed. I'd be willing to see what they are or take suggestions if they find we have typos or anything like errors that don't make sense. Because we try to review the cooperative, we provide the cooperative agreement language every fiscal year, and we try to go through it to make sure that we don't have any errors, or we do update it every year if we find things. So. Okay,
and as a follow-up, what about flexibility around, you know, in some states, the state may require language that's not allowed in the agreement, and is there any process for trying to reconcile that, maybe through this idea of getting a template ahead of time?
Maybe it sounds like maybe they're talking about, so if there is state ranking criteria that requires something to occur, and the parcel is selected based off that criteria, then that can be required for the parcel language. But I don't quite follow the question.
Yeah, and I think this one, what we may do, Jerome, is actually follow up with an offline and make sure that we actually capture really what they're asking, and then we'll follow up with you separately.
That would be great.
In the meantime, we've had a couple of other questions. So there's one just about if you could describe the process for becoming a certified entity.
Yeah. So the certified entity process was streamlined significantly in ALE compared to FRPP. There's a package for certification that's submitted to the state office that contains that outlines the entity's ability to meet the ALE certification requirements, and all of this is also certification requirements and the certification package request. Package information is all in the ALE program manual, but you submit to your state office the package that shows how many easements you've had related to ALE, what your stewardship of your easements, monitoring that you do on your easements, your 5 most recently closed easements funded with NRCS funding, conservation easements, and the final title policy opinions. You have to submit that to the state. So you submit the package to your state office. The state office reviews that package for completeness. They may come back to you to say if they need more items. Then the state, once they have a complete package, the state office reviews that, and then the state conservationist makes a recommendation to the regional conservationist office on whether or not the entity should be certified. They take that package, submit that recommendation in a package to the regional conservationist. The regional conservationist office reviews those certification packages and reviews the information in it. And then the regional conservationist is actually where you get approval for being a certified entity or not. After they review it, they go through a review process where they consult with Easement Program Division and look over those documents. We provide our input. They approve or deny the certification, and then they send a letter to the entity and to the state conservationist saying that they're approved. And at that point, you're a certified entity. You can enter into grant agreements with NRCS, a certified entity. And if you're doing it for, you can be certified in an individual state, or if you're an entity that covers multi-states, you can choose to be certified in one state and maybe not the other state, or you can choose to submit the application for certification in all the states that you do work in.
Okay, so we're just about at time, so there's time for probably 1 or 2 more questions. There's one in queue. So this one is to do with the entity. So what if the entity that is described as going to be the holder of the easement has shifted during the process? Can the cooperative agreement be revised to change to a new easement holder?
So if you have a co-holder role, yes, we have to do an amendment to that cooperative agreement. It's a little bit different if the entity that is shifting is the one that's receiving the funds. Then the answer would be we'd have to do a different agreement at that point. So it kind of depends on what the role of that entity that is leaving is.
Okay. So that was the final question that we see. I'll just put out another call if there are any final questions.
Set your final answers.
Okay, well, I don't see any, so being none, I'd like to just thank Jerome for today's presentation and the other NRCS staff for being available and on hand. We really appreciate your time. As a reminder to all participants, we'll be writing up the answers to the questions that were asked. If anything occurs to you after the fact, feel free to email me at jdempsey, DEMPSEY@farmland.org, and we'll try to field it for you. We'll post all the materials, questions, answers, the recorded webinar on the Farmland Information Center website, and we'll send you out an email notification when all those materials are available. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Bye-bye.